All right. Hello. 4.2 amplitude, reflection, and period. Uh, Before we get into all those fancy words we start out with, let's graph y equals 2 cosine theta. So I'm going to pick a couple points. Let's start with 0. Cosine of 0 is 1, as we know, but we have a 2 on the outside, so we have to multiply by 2. So it's going to go up to 2. And then let's try pi over 2. Cosine of pi over 2 is 0, and 0 times 2 is 0. I'll call that pi over 2. Point right there. And cosine of pi. Cosine of pi is -1. -1 times 2 is -2. So we'll call that pi, and we'll go down to -2. If we did 3 pi over 2, and cosine of 3 pi over 2, -1, excuse me, not -1, 0, and then 0 times 2 is 0. Go back to 0, and then we got 5 pi over 2, and that will go back up to 2. Excuse me, that was 2 pi. Cosine of 2 pi is 1. 1 times 2 is 2. And we make our curve. So what happened now is different. The main thing that happened now is different is that our outputs changed from -1 to 1 to -2 to 2. That's the only thing that really changed here. So our outputs kind of increased a little bit as a result. We call that amplitude, right? So amplitude, if we have any trig, not any trig value, but any sine cosine, where y equals a times sine theta, or y equals a cosine theta, amplitude is defined as the absolute value of a. Whatever that number in front is, the absolute value of that is, in fact, its amplitude. That tells you half of the height of your wave. Meaning, if the length of your wave is 4 here, right? What's your amplitude? It's 2. Half of 4 is 2. All right, let's try this one. We have y equals -3 sine x. What's going on here? -3 sine, so that means we have an amplitude of what? That's not my pointer. Amplitude of what? 3. Not -3, 3. Okay? Now, what changes here? As you might remember, when we have a negative up front, we are reflecting over the x-axis. So we are going to start with, if we sine 0 is 0, so nothing's really changing here, still 0, 0. But if I put pi over 2 in, that's pi over 2 we're going to call. Sine of pi over 2 is 1. 1 times -3 is -3. 1, 2, 3. And there we go, there's a point. And then we're going to go to pi. Sine of pi is 0 again, so we're going to just go back to 0. And then sine of 3 pi over 2. And that's going to get us -1 for sine of 3 pi over 2. And then multiply that by -3, and we're going to go up to 3. And if we go to 2 pi, sine of 2 pi is 0. And then, of course, 0 times anything is 0. So as stated, we reflected over the x-axis, right? So the two changes that happened, we had a stretch of 3, vertical stretch of 3, and it reflected over the x-axis. Amplitude is 3. So those are some of the basics of what this graph is. Now let's talk about period. Period is essentially the length of one cycle of your graph, okay? A period for sine or cosine starts at 2 pi, okay? All the basic ones we did in the first section, and now it always starts at 2 pi. Now what changes that is the number right here, okay? So the two changes we talked about so far is y equals a, we'll say sine just for fun, also applies for cosine, a sine bx, being whatever that number is right there, being that b value, take 2 pi divided by that number, and that's going to get you your period. That's one cycle. Okay? So with y equals cosine 2x, remember cosine does this little move. Oop, did not mean to move the whole thing. Let's fix that. Cosine does one of these things, right? And that is from 0 to 2 pi, right? That's one cycle. Now that we have cosine 2x, instead of it being a period of 2 pi, we have a period of 2 pi divided by 2, which is pi. So that means this is happening quicker, right? So it's happening in half the time. So when we draw this, amplitude's still 1, so yay us. And I label this, the end right here is pi. The end right here is pi over 2, and the output's -1. So it cut everything in half. Still 0, 1 though. Half is 0, still 0. And that right there is going to be pi over 2. Excuse me, pi over 4 rather. Pi over 4 comma 0. And this is going to be 3 pi over 4 comma 0. A little tip, whenever we get some more b values that are a little different, think about what all the main points were in the original, right? The original had 0, pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. And think about where they're at with cosine, right? And just take all those values and divide them by whatever b is. That usually helps a little bit with trying to figure out what exactly those fractions are. So just a little tip for you. So here's one where we do get a little more complicated, right? We got y equals -2 sine of -1/3 x. So let's play around with this a little bit. So period is 2 pi over -1/3, which is equal to -6 pi, but period can't be negative, so we're just going to go with 6 pi. Okay, so that's how long a period is. We also have amplitude. Amplitude is 2. Okay, so when we graph this, I'm going to go all the way to 6 pi. Our sine graph, we know at the original, we would end up here right at 0, right? Now what's happening between there? It's still 0, 0 right here, right? Nothing's happening. We know the amplitude's 2, so I'm going to go up to 2, call that 2, call this -2. Now the halfway point, it hits 0 again, right? So halfway between 0 and 6 pi is going to be 0. Not 0, 3 pi rather. Halfway between 0 and 6 pi is 3 pi. Now, halfway between these two values will be our next big point, these two values being 0 and 3 pi. So halfway is going to be 3 pi over 2. And what's going to be happening there, if we put 3 pi over 2 in here, let's just test it for fun. We put 3 pi over 2 in there. That's going to get us -3 pi over 6, which is going to reduce down to negative pi over 2. Also, another thing I should throw out here, this is where our odd and even functions come into play, right? So if we have a negative in the inside right here, what does that mean for this function as a whole? We are actually kind of playing with y equals 2 sine of 1/3 x, right? That's kind of how we're actually playing with this function, right? Because of our even and odd functions that we learned about in the last section. So really, at 3 pi over 2, we're going up to 2, like we normally would in a 2 sine 1/3 x type of graph. So those negatives kind of outdid themselves here. They just cancel each other out. So we got one of those going on, and halfway between 3 pi and 6 pi is going to be 9 pi over 2. 9 pi over 2 all the way down to -2. And there is one cycle of -2 sine of -1/3 x. Last graph for this video, we have y equals cosine pi x. So amplitude equal to 1. Period Period's equal to 2 pi over pi, which is just equal to 2. So, that means one of these motions right here, so it's going to start at 1, go down to -1, and do one of these. Okay? That's going to go all the way to 2. That's 1 period. Halfway in between is 1. Right? So we have a point 1, comma, -1. We have a point right here, 2, comma, 1. And we have halfway points here in between of 3/2, comma, 0, and 1/2, comma, 0. I hope this video helped. We'll see you in class, okay? Bye-bye.